Welcome back to Lore at Night, where rain falls softly and every story carries a shadow. I'm always curious to hear where in the world you're listening from, so comment that down below. Now get comfortable, and let's begin. Story 1. The last sound many people in Jonestown would ever hear was a voice. It was calm and steady, amplified through loudspeakers mounted on wooden poles. It drifted across rows of small cottages and through the thick jungle air. For years, that voice had told them how to live, how to think, and how to survive in a world they had been taught to fear. On November 18, 1978, it would also tell them how to die. But Jonestown did not begin with death. It began with hope. In the years following World War II, the United States was changing quickly and painfully. The country was wrestling with segregation, poverty, and the growing sense that traditional institutions were failing the people who needed them most. Churches were still full, but many Americans felt spiritually unmoored. Faith no longer felt like refuge. For those living on the margins, it often felt like rejection. Jim Jones understood that hunger better than most. He was born in 1931 in rural Indiana, into a family marked by poverty and instability. His childhood was lonely. Neighbors later recalled a boy who kept mostly to himself, fascinated by religion and death. He attended multiple churches, sometimes several in a single week. He listened carefully, not just to the sermons, but to the reactions of the crowd. He learned how emotion could be guided and how authority could be claimed. As a young man, Jones became deeply influenced by two forces that would shape his future. The first was Christianity, particularly Pentecostal traditions that emphasized miracles and emotional worship. The second was political ideology. Jones read widely about socialism and Marxism, believing capitalism to be inherently cruel. Over time, these belief systems did not compete within him. They merged. By the early 1950s, Jones was preaching in Indianapolis. He founded a small church that would eventually be called the People's Temple. From the start, it stood apart. Jones insisted on racial integration, something still rare and controversial in Midwestern churches at the time. Black and white families sat together. The poor were welcomed. The elderly and disabled were embraced rather than sidelined. Jones did not simply preach compassion. He practiced it publicly. The temple ran soup kitchens and food drives. Members helped one another find jobs and housing. For people who had been ignored or mistreated by society, the church offered dignity. It offered structure. Most importantly, it offered belonging. For many, Jim Jones seemed to be the embodiment of everything a pastor should be. Inside the church, however, another dynamic was taking shape. Jones demanded commitment that went beyond faith. Members were encouraged to attend multiple services each week. They were urged to volunteer their time and gradually to surrender more of their personal autonomy. Loyalty to the temple became loyalty to Jones himself. Faith healings became a central feature of services. During emotionally charged gatherings, Jones would call out illnesses from the pulpit. Members would approach him in tears. He would touch them, pray over them, and declare them healed. Tumors were said to vanish. Pain disappeared. The crowd responded with awe and gratitude. What most did not know was that these moments were carefully orchestrated. Temple insiders later described how illnesses were exaggerated or fabricated, and how props were sometimes used to simulate miraculous results. But for those in the pews, the effect was real. Belief deepened. Doubt retreated. As the People's Temple grew, so did Jones's control. Members were encouraged to donate money and property to the church. Some signed over their homes. Others turned over their savings. Parents were pressured to allow the temple to play an increasingly central role in raising their children. Communal living arrangements blurred personal boundaries and increased dependence on the group. Criticism was not tolerated. Those who questioned Jones were confronted publicly. Confession sessions became common, where members were pressured to admit perceived moral failings in front of the congregation. Humiliation was framed as spiritual correction. Over time, fear replaced trust as the glue holding the community together. Jones's sermons grew darker. He spoke frequently about enemies and conspiracies. He warned that the government was preparing to persecute people like them. He said fascism was rising in America and that concentration camps were inevitable. Only the People's Temple, he insisted, was prepared to resist. Fear became a tool. In the mid-1960s, Jones claimed to have received a prophetic vision of nuclear war. He said much of the United States would be destroyed. California, he told his followers, would be safer. It was both a warning and an instruction. The People's Temple relocated west. In California, Jones's influence expanded rapidly. The church established a strong presence in San Francisco and Los Angeles. Its members were politically active and highly organized. They canvassed neighborhoods, attended rallies, and delivered votes. In return, Jones gained access. Prominent politicians praised his work with the poor and the marginalized. He was appointed to civic boards. Photographs from the time show him smiling alongside city officials, his arm around mayors and assembly members. Publicly, he was celebrated as a progressive religious leader. Privately, the abuse inside the temple intensified. Members were physically punished. Children were beaten. Couples were separated as a means of control. Jones dictated relationships, sleep schedules, diets, and sexual behavior. Information from the outside world was increasingly filtered or blocked entirely. Leaving the temple became dangerous. Former members were labeled traitors. Jones warned that defectors would be hunted, arrested, or killed. He claimed to have contacts in law enforcement and intelligence agencies. Whether true or not, many believed him. By the early 1970s, Jones began speaking openly about leaving the United States altogether. He described America as irredeemable, racist, violent, corrupt beyond saving. The future, he said, lay elsewhere. Somewhere isolated. Somewhere they could build a society entirely their own. He found that place in Guyana, a small English-speaking nation on the northern coast of South America. Guyana offered land, isolation, and limited oversight. Dense rainforest made access difficult. The government, eager for development, was receptive. Jones called the project the People's Temple Agricultural Mission. It would become known as Jonestown. At first, only a small group went. They were sent ahead to clear land and begin construction. Their letters home were read aloud during services. They spoke of purpose and unity. They spoke of a new beginning. What they did not speak of was how alone they were. By the time hundreds more would follow, the path forward would feel like destiny, and the path back would all but disappear. By the time most residents arrived in the mid to late 1970s, the settlement had already taken on the language of permanence. This was not described as a commune or a refuge. It was described as home. Jim Jones told his followers they were pioneers, builders of a new world, and survivors of a collapsing one. For many, especially those who had already sacrificed nearly everything to get there, believing him was easier than confronting the alternative. The land itself was unforgiving. Jonestown sat deep within the Guyanese rainforest, far from major towns, and accessible only by rough roads and small plains. Thick jungle pressed in from all sides. The heat was constant and heavy. Insects swarmed. Disease was common. What had been promised as fertile farmland quickly revealed itself to be difficult and resistant to cultivation. Still, residents worked from dawn until well after sunset. Days began early, often before the sun rose. Loudspeakers mounted throughout the camp signaled the start of work. Men, women, teenagers, and elderly residents were assigned to agricultural labor, construction, kitchen duty, or childcare. The work was physically exhausting and relentless. Breaks were rare. Complaints were discouraged. Food was scarce. Meals consisted largely of rice, beans, and occasionally vegetables grown in the settlement. Protein was limited. Children and the elderly often went hungry. Jones told residents that shortages were temporary and that sacrifice was noble. Hunger, he said, was proof of commitment. Medical care was inconsistent and controlled. Jonestown had a small medical clinic staffed by temple members, some with limited training. Access to care often depended on one's standing within the community. Prescription drugs were tightly regulated and sometimes used to sedate or control behavior. Jones himself consumed large quantities of medication, a fact that was visible to those around him. Privacy did not exist. Living quarters were small and overcrowded. Families were often separated. Children slept in communal areas. Letters were read before being sent. Incoming mail was screened or never delivered at all. Radios and newspapers were restricted. The outside world was filtered entirely through Jones. And Jones was always present. His voice echoed through the settlement day and night. Loudspeakers broadcast sermons, political lectures, and increasingly paranoid monologues. Sometimes the broadcasts continued for hours after midnight. Residents learned to fall asleep to his voice, absorbing it even in exhaustion. Jones spoke constantly about enemies. He warned that the United States government was monitoring them. He claimed that mercenaries and intelligence agents were preparing to invade the settlement. He told residents that defectors were spreading lies and plotting revenge. Fear was no longer abstract. It was woven into daily life. To reinforce that fear, Jones staged rehearsals. They were called White Nights. During these drills, residents were awakened suddenly, sometimes in the middle of the night. They were assembled in the central pavilion and told that the community was under immediate threat. Armed guards stood nearby. Jones spoke urgently, describing imminent attacks or mass arrests. Sometimes the drills ended with speeches about resistance and loyalty. Other times they went further. On several occasions, residents were instructed to drink liquid that Jones claimed was poison. Parents gave it to their children first. Afterward, Jones would announce that it had been a test. He praised those who complied quickly. He shamed those who hesitated. Each White Night served a purpose. They normalized the idea of collective death. They tested obedience. They reinforced the belief that survival depended on absolute unity. Punishment was swift and public. Those who broke rules or expressed doubt were disciplined. Some were assigned extra labor. Others were confined to isolation or subjected to physical punishment. Children were beaten in front of the community. Adults were humiliated during meetings where confessions were demanded. Jones framed all of it as necessary. He spoke of building a perfect society and insisted that perfection required sacrifice. He reminded residents that the outside world was violent and cruel, and that any suffering inside Jonestown was small by comparison. For some, cracks began to form. Illness spread. Exhaustion deepened. Promises of improvement went unfulfilled. A few residents managed to escape, often during work details or supply runs. Those who left told stories of abuse and control. Jones responded by tightening his grip. He told those who remained that defectors were liars. He claimed they were being used by the government to destroy the temple. He said their families would suffer as a result. Children, in particular, were weaponized. Jones encouraged them to spy on adults. He praised loyalty and punished dissent. Parents were pressured to prove their devotion through obedience, even when it conflicted with their instincts to protect their own children. As months passed, Jonestown became increasingly isolated. both physically and psychologically. The jungle was no longer just geography. It was a barrier. It kept residents from seeing alternatives, from imagining escape, from remembering who they had been before. Yet from the outside, Jonestown still looked functional. Carefully managed letters and visits suggested a thriving agricultural community. Photographs showed smiling faces and communal meals. Jones continued to cultivate allies abroad and supporters back in the United States. But the balance was fragile. Behind the scenes, Jones's health was deteriorating. He was increasingly paranoid and erratic. He slept little and relied heavily on drugs. His speeches grew more rambling, more apocalyptic. He spoke openly about death as a form of protest. By 1978, concern among relatives in the United States had reached a breaking point. Parents wrote letters. Former members spoke to journalists. Advocacy groups formed. The stories they told were disturbing and consistent. People were being held against their will. Children were at risk. A charismatic leader was exerting total control over an isolated population. The pressure began to build. And slowly, the world that Jones had tried so desperately to shut out began to push its way in. The convoy reached Jonestown in the late afternoon, after hours of travel through jungle roads and thick heat. When the visitors stepped out, what they saw appeared carefully composed. Children lined up and sang. Adults smiled and shook hands. Hand-painted signs praised socialism, unity, and peace. It looked, at first glance, like a functioning and cooperative community. Jim Jones greeted Congressman Leo Ryan personally. He appeared frail and subdued, speaking softly and moving slowly. He thanked Ryan for coming and spoke about equality, hard work, and persecution from the outside world. Journalists took notes. Cameras rolled. For a moment, the tension felt contained. Residents had been instructed on how to behave. Complaints were not voiced. Smiles were practiced. Conversations were monitored. Those who had doubts stayed quiet, aware of who was watching and what could follow if they spoke out of turn. That evening, a program was staged in the central pavilion. Music filled the space. Residents performed songs and short presentations. Jones sat on stage, occasionally rising to praise the community and criticize those who opposed it. Applause came quickly, often too quickly. But the performance was fragile. During the gathering, a temple member quietly slipped a handwritten note to one of the journalists. It was brief and desperate. It asked for help. It said that people were being held against their will. The illusion did not collapse in that moment, but it cracked. As the night went on, Ryan spoke privately with residents. A few hinted at fear. Others avoided him entirely. Jones watched closely, aware that control was slipping. By the time the visitors prepared to sleep, Jonestown felt different. Something had shifted. Morning came quickly in Jonestown, but the tension from the night before never lifted. The air felt heavy, even before the heat set in. Congressman Leo Ryan rose, knowing that something beneath the surface had shifted. The smiles from the previous day had not vanished, but they no longer felt convincing. They felt strained, as if held in place by fear. Ryan began the day by speaking with residents individually. He made it clear that anyone who wanted to leave Jonestown could do so with him. There would be no punishment, he said, no consequences. The offer was simple, but the cost of accepting it was not. At first, no one stepped forward. Jones remained nearby, listening. His presence was enough. Leaving meant defying the man who controlled food, sleep, families, and safety. It meant risking retaliation. It also meant abandoning loved ones who might not be allowed to follow. Slowly, one person stood, then another. A young couple asked to leave together. A mother asked if her children could come. Others followed in hesitant succession. Each movement was small, but together they formed a visible fracture in Jones's authority. Arguments broke out. Some temple members tried to stop those leaving. Voices rose. Jones insisted that the defectors were confused and manipulated. He accused the visitors of coercion. Ryan remained calm, repeating that the choice was voluntary. By early afternoon, more than a dozen residents had chosen to leave. Jones's demeanor changed. The softness from the previous day faded. He retreated to speak with his inner circle, his words urgent and clipped. Armed guards became more visible. The loudspeakers stayed silent. As trucks were prepared to transport the group to the Port Kaituma airstrip, Jones approached Ryan. He looked directly at him and said, "I wonder if I could come with you." It was not delivered lightly. It carried exhaustion, fear, and something close to panic. Ryan did not answer. The trucks rolled away from Jonestown, carrying defectors, journalists, and the congressional delegation. As the jungle closed in around the road, some passengers cried quietly. Others stared straight ahead, unsure whether they were truly free. Behind them, Jonestown stood silent, and Jim Jones watched them go. The Port Kaituma airstrip was quiet when the trucks arrived. 2 small planes waited on the tarmac, engines cooling in the heat. As defectors gathered their belongings, the tension followed them out of the jungle. It did not ease. It sharpened. Without warning, a temple member lunged at Congressman Leo Ryan with a knife. Others intervened, pulling him away. Ryan was shaken, but unharmed. It was a final signal of how fragile the situation had become. Moments later, a tractor pulling a trailer appeared at the edge of the airstrip. Inside were armed members of the People's Temple. They opened fire. Gunshots tore through the air. Ryan was struck almost immediately. Journalists, aides, and defectors ran or fell where they stood. Some were killed instantly. Others were left wounded on the ground, bleeding and calling for help as the attackers fled back into the jungle. Congressman Leo Ryan was dead. By the time the guns fell silent, the visit was over, and the point of no return had been crossed. The gunshots at Port Kaituma did not echo only through the jungle. They echoed through Jim Jones's imagination exactly as he had always feared and predicted. Within hours, the news reached Jonestown. Congressman Leo Ryan was dead. Journalists were dead. The outside world now had bodies instead of allegations. Jones understood what this meant. For years, he had told his followers that the government would come for them, that violence was inevitable, that the temple would be destroyed if exposed. Now, in his mind, the prophecy had fulfilled itself. There would be no investigation that ended quietly, no negotiation, no return to isolation. Jonestown was no longer hidden. As evening approached, residents were ordered to gather in the central pavilion. Loudspeakers summoned everyone, including children. Armed guards took their positions. The settlement, which had always felt controlled, now felt sealed. Jim Jones took the microphone. His voice was strained but resolute. He told the community that Congressman Ryan's death meant retaliation was certain. He said troops would arrive. He said children would be taken and tortured. He said the experiment was over. This was not a sudden decision. Jones had rehearsed this moment in words for months, even years. Now he presented it as the only remaining option. He framed what he proposed not as suicide, but as revolutionary protest, a final act of defiance against a cruel and oppressive world. He called it revolutionary suicide. Jones spoke at length, sometimes rambling, sometimes lucid. He argued that death was preferable to the loss of dignity. He insisted that their children would be safer dead than alive in the hands of enemies. He reminded residents of the White Nights, telling them this time it was real. Some people protested. Audio recordings later revealed voices crying, questioning, begging for alternatives. A few suggested fleeing into the jungle. Jones dismissed the idea. He said they would be hunted down. He said escape was impossible. The atmosphere grew heavy and chaotic. Large containers of grape-flavored drink were brought forward. The mixture contained cyanide and sedatives. Nurses and medical staff, following orders, prepared syringes and cups. Parents were instructed to bring their children forward first. This was the most devastating command Jones ever gave. Children cried as poison was administered, some by syringe, others by cup. Parents held them as their bodies convulsed and stilled. Screams filled the pavilion. Jones continued speaking over the noise, urging calm, urging speed, urging obedience. Some adults resisted. A few attempted to hide or flee. Armed guards enforced compliance. The jungle that had once symbolized escape now served as a boundary. Most stayed. Exhaustion, fear, loyalty, and psychological captivity converged in that moment. One by one, adults followed. Some drank willingly, others were coerced. The poison worked quickly. Bodies covered the ground, layered around the pavilion. Music played softly from the loudspeakers as the settlement fell silent. Jim Jones did not drink the poison. He was found later with a gunshot wound to the head, believed to be self-inflicted. Around him lay more than 900 dead, including over 300 children. Jonestown was no longer a community. It was a grave. The first outsiders to reach Jonestown were not prepared for what they found. When Guyanese soldiers and investigators arrived, the settlement was eerily quiet. The loudspeakers were silent. The jungle pressed in as it always had. Then, as they moved closer to the central pavilion, the scale of the tragedy became impossible to comprehend. Bodies lay everywhere. They were clustered around the pavilion, in cottages, along walkways. Adults and children lay together, many still holding one another. Some appeared peaceful. Others showed signs of convulsions and struggle. The sheer number of the dead overwhelmed those on the ground. There were more than 900 bodies, including over 300 children. At first, officials underestimated the toll. The count rose slowly as the full extent of the settlement was uncovered. Each number carried weight. Each one represented a life that had believed, hoped, and trusted. The world reacted with shock. News of the massacre spread rapidly. Photographs from Jonestown appeared in newspapers and on television screens around the globe. The image of hundreds of bodies lying face down in the jungle became one of the most haunting visuals of the 20th century. For many, it was incomprehensible. How could so many people follow one man to their deaths? In the days that followed, the narrative began to take shape. Jim Jones was labeled a madman. His followers were dismissed as brainwashed or weak. The phrase, "drinking the Kool-Aid," entered popular language, stripped of its horror and reduced to a metaphor. In doing so, much of the human reality was lost. The truth was more complex and more disturbing. The people who died in Jonestown were not foolish. Many were idealistic. Many were searching for justice, equality, and community in a world that had failed them. They had been drawn in by genuine acts of compassion and social activism. Over time, those ideals were weaponized against them. Jonestown did not happen overnight. It was built gradually through manipulation, isolation, fear, and the systematic erosion of autonomy. Each small surrender made the next one easier. By the time the final choice was presented, it no longer felt like a choice at all. Investigations followed. Survivors, including those who had escaped earlier, and a handful who were away from the settlement on the day of the massacre, gave testimony. The audio recording of the final hours, known as the death tape, was released. Listening to it revealed not hysteria, but order. Not chaos, but control. The tragedy forced difficult conversations. How much power should any leader hold? How do charismatic figures exploit idealism? How do communities slide from hope into harm? Jonestown became a case study in coercive control long before the term was widely used. It reshaped how governments and organizations viewed cult dynamics, religious movements, and psychological abuse. For the families left behind, there was no closure. Many never recovered the bodies of their loved ones. Some were buried in mass graves. Others were returned without explanation or accountability. Grief was compounded by stigma, by shame, and by public misunderstanding. Yet, Jonestown also left a warning. It showed how easily good intentions can be twisted, how isolation can distort reality, how fear, when repeated often enough, can feel like truth. It reminded the world that atrocities are not always committed by strangers or monsters, but by communities that slowly lose their ability to question. Today, Jonestown stands abandoned, reclaimed by the jungle. The structures have collapsed, the paths have disappeared. Nature has erased much of what was built there. What remains is memory. Jonestown is not just a story about death. It is a story about belief, about trust, and about the danger of surrendering one's voice to anyone who claims absolute certainty. It is a reminder that the most destructive journeys often begin with the promise of a better world. Story 2. Before the night that would define it forever, the Peterson household in Durham, North Carolina appeared, at least from the outside, to be a place of comfort, intellect, and routine. It was not a home marked by visible chaos or obvious danger. It was, instead, a blended family, shaped by prior losses, strong personalities, and long-established patterns that few outsiders ever fully understood. Michael Peterson was a writer. For much of his adult life, he had defined himself through words, columns, novels, political commentary. He was articulate, confident, and accustomed to being listened to. Raised in a military family, Peterson spent portions of his youth overseas, an experience he later described as formative. He served in the United States Marine Corps during the Vietnam War, an experience he also returned to repeatedly in his writing and public identity. Those who knew him often remarked on his ability to command a room, to speak fluently and persuasively, and to project an image of cultivated authority. By the time he settled in Durham, Peterson had already lived several distinct lives. He had been married once before, had children from that marriage, and had spent years establishing himself as a local columnist. His writing frequently addressed politics, civic issues, and social values. He was not a private figure. In Durham, he was known, if not famous, then at least recognizable. Kathleen Peterson, born Kathleen Atwater, came from a different professional world. She worked in technology and telecommunications, building a career defined by structure, advancement, and corporate responsibility. Colleagues described her as organized, driven, and reliable. She was, by most accounts, deeply committed to her work and took pride in her professional independence. Kathleen had been married before as well and had one daughter from that relationship. When she met Michael, both were adults with established identities, habits, and histories. Their relationship did not begin in youth or uncertainty. It began with deliberation. Friends later recalled them as a couple who appeared intellectually matched. They entertained often. Conversations in their home ranged from politics to literature to current events. They shared wine, debate, and the sense of having built something stable later in life. The house itself, a large, cedar-sided home tucked into a wooded area, played a central role in their shared life. It was not merely a residence, but a gathering place. Children from previous relationships moved in and out of the household over time. At various points, the home included Michael's sons, Kathleen's daughter, and later, 2 young women whom Michael had raised after the death of their biological parents. The family structure was unconventional, but not secretive. Those close to the Petersons knew that the household was complex, layered, and shaped by past tragedies that predated Kathleen's death. Despite this complexity, there was little outward indication of crisis. Financially, the household appeared stable. Socially, they were active. The marriage, from the perspective of friends and co-workers, seemed solid. Kathleen was often described as devoted to her family and generous with her time. Michael, for his part, was expressive and affectionate in public settings, unafraid to speak about his admiration for his wife. But even in relationships that appear steady, there are private dimensions, invisible to the outside world. Like many couples, the Petersons balanced work pressures, parenting responsibilities, and the emotional residue of earlier lives. Kathleen's career required long hours and frequent focus. Michael's writing career, while publicly visible, did not always provide consistent income. These differences existed quietly, without public conflict, and were not uncommon in households where one partner worked in a structured corporate environment and the other in creative fields. What is important in understanding this case is restraint. There is no verified record of chronic domestic violence in the Peterson marriage. There are no confirmed reports of repeated police calls, restraining orders, or medical documentation suggesting a history of physical abuse between Michael and Kathleen. That absence does not prove harmony, nor does it prove hidden violence. It simply defines the limits of what can be responsibly stated. The Peterson home, in the period leading up to Kathleen's death, functioned much as it had for years, busy, layered, and familiar. Children came and went. The couple socialized. Life continued along its established tracks. This is where the story must begin, not with blood or sirens, but with context, with two adults who had chosen one another later in life, carrying with them their pasts, their habits, and their expectations, with a house that held many histories at once, and with the understanding that what would later be scrutinized under a microscope once existed as ordinary routine. In the next section, the focus will narrow further on the dynamics within the household, the pressures that existed beneath the surface, and the subtle fault lines that would later be examined in hindsight. The final evening of Kathleen Peterson's life began without urgency. There were no emergency calls, no abrupt departures from routine, no reported arguments overheard by neighbors. What is known about that night comes from a limited set of sources: Michael Peterson's statements, physical evidence inside the home, and the absence of contradictory witnesses. Together, they form a timeline that is narrow, incomplete, and heavily scrutinized. Kathleen returned home from work after a long day. Her job had demanded increasing attention in recent months, and colleagues later confirmed that she had been under pressure. That evening, however, there is no evidence she expressed fear, distress, or an intention to leave the marriage. There are no confirmed communications suggesting she believed she was in danger. Michael and Kathleen spent the evening at home. According to Michael, they shared dinner and wine. At some point, they moved outside to sit by the pool area behind the house. This was not an unusual activity for them. Friends had visited the property before and described the pool area as a place where the couple often relaxed, talked, and unwound. There were no witnesses to this time together. No neighbors reported shouting or raised voices. No phone calls were placed to friends or family indicating conflict. The house remained quiet. Michael later stated that Kathleen decided to go inside while he remained outdoors for a period of time. He would say that she intended to go upstairs to prepare for bed. According to his account, there was nothing unusual about this separation. It fit their routine. Kathleen had work responsibilities the next day. Michael, by contrast, often stayed up late. What happened next is the central question of the case, and also where certainty begins to fracture. At some point, Michael entered the house and found Kathleen at the bottom of the staircase leading from the first floor to the second. She was lying on her back, her head near the base of the stairs. Blood was present on the floor and walls of the stairwell. Kathleen was not breathing. Michael called emergency services. The call, which would later be played repeatedly in court, captured a man in distress reporting that his wife had fallen down the stairs and was badly hurt. He stated that she was still alive at first, then later said she had stopped breathing. Emergency responders arrived to find Kathleen deceased. The scene they encountered was immediately striking. Blood was not confined to a small area. It was visible along the walls of the stairwell, on the floor, and on Kathleen's body. First responders noted the volume of blood as unusual for a simple fall, though such impressions were observational rather than medical conclusions. Kathleen was pronounced dead at the scene. From the moment authorities entered the home, the stairwell became the focal point. The narrow space, the positioning of the body, and the presence of blood demanded explanation. Was this the result of an accidental fall, or something else? Michael told investigators that Kathleen had been drinking and may have slipped. He did not report witnessing the fall. His account relied on the assumption that she had lost her footing while ascending the stairs. At this early stage, no one accused Michael of a crime. But the scene raised questions that could not be easily resolved. The amount of blood suggested multiple lacerations. Kathleen had deep cuts on her scalp. There were no fractures to her skull, but the injuries were severe. Investigators documented the scene carefully. Photographs were taken. Blood patterns were noted. Kathleen's body was examined at the scene before being transported for autopsy. Michael remained cooperative. He did not attempt to leave. He answered questions. His demeanor would later become a point of debate, but at the time no immediate conclusions were drawn. What is critical to understand is that the evidence did not speak with one voice. Falls can be violent. Staircases can be unforgiving. Head wounds bleed heavily. At the same time, certain aspects of the scene did not align neatly with a simple accident. This ambiguity defined the case from the very beginning. There was no clear narrative imposed by the facts alone. Instead, there were competing interpretations, each plausible on its own, yet mutually exclusive. As the night turned into early morning, Kathleen Peterson's death shifted from a private tragedy to a forensic investigation. The home was secured. Evidence was collected. Michael was not arrested, but he was no longer simply a grieving husband. He was the only person known to be with Kathleen in her final hours. In the next section, the focus will turn to the medical findings, the autopsy, the injuries, and how experts would later disagree about what Kathleen's body could and could not reveal. When Kathleen Peterson's body was examined, it became clear that the physical findings would shape the entire course of the investigation. Unlike cases built on eyewitnesses or confessions, this case would hinge on interpretation, on what injuries could reliably say about cause, force, and intent, and on where certainty ended. The autopsy revealed multiple deep lacerations to Kathleen's scalp. These cuts were significant, some extending several inches, and they accounted for the extensive blood loss observed at the scene. Importantly, however, there were no fractures to the skull. The absence of skull fractures would later become a central point of debate, because severe head trauma often, but not always, produces fractures. Kathleen also had bruising on her face, arms, and legs. Some of these injuries were consistent with a fall, while others were more ambiguous. Defensive wounds, injuries typically associated with attempts to ward off an attack, were not clearly present. Neither were injuries conclusively tied to strangulation or suffocation. The medical examiner concluded that Kathleen died from blood loss due to multiple blunt force injuries to the head. The manner of death was ruled a homicide. This determination did not identify a specific weapon or mechanism, only that the injuries were inflicted by blunt force and were not consistent, in the examiner's opinion, with an accidental fall alone. This ruling immediately altered the trajectory of the case. A homicide determination does not assign legal guilt, but it does signal that investigators should pursue criminal charges. Michael Peterson became the focus of that inquiry. From the defense perspective, the medical findings did not conclusively rule out an accident. Experts would later testify that scalp lacerations can occur from repeated impacts against stair edges, door frames, or molding. Blood loss can be severe even without skull fractures. A person who falls, attempts to stand, falls again, and remains conscious for a period of time could theoretically produce the scene observed. The prosecution, however, emphasized the number and severity of the lacerations. They argued that the injuries suggested repeated blows rather than accidental impacts. They pointed to the blood spatter patterns on the walls as evidence of force applied while Kathleen was upright or moving. Bloodstain pattern analysis became a cornerstone of the state's case. Analysts testified that certain patterns indicated cast-off blood, blood flung from an object in motion, rather than passive dripping. This interpretation supported the theory of an assault. Yet, bloodstain analysis itself is not an exact science. Its conclusions depend heavily on interpretation, training, and context. Later scrutiny would challenge the reliability of some of these methods, but at this stage, they were presented as authoritative. No murder weapon was ever identified. No blunt object bearing Kathleen's blood was recovered. This absence complicated the prosecution's narrative but did not invalidate it. The state argued that a weapon could have been removed or cleaned, or that the injuries were inflicted using hands or an object from the environment. Michael Peterson maintained that Kathleen fell. He denied striking her and denied any physical altercation. He did not change his account in the immediate aftermath. As investigators dug deeper, they began to look beyond the stairwell. Financial records were reviewed. Computer files were examined. Michael's personal life came under scrutiny. It was during this phase that his undisclosed sexual relationships with men came to light, a fact that would later become central to the prosecution's portrayal of motive. The theory advanced by the state was not that Michael killed Kathleen because of a single argument or momentary rage, but that a confrontation occurred when hidden aspects of his life were at risk of exposure. The evidence for this theory was circumstantial. There were no confirmed communications showing Kathleen had discovered his secret. There were no witnesses to an argument that night. Still, the existence of secrecy provided a narrative framework that prosecutors would later use to explain why an otherwise stable marriage could end in violence. At this stage, however, the investigation was still unfolding. Michael had not yet been charged. The case was being built piece by piece, largely around forensic interpretation rather than direct evidence. The medical findings had not answered the central question. They had sharpened it. Was Kathleen Peterson's death the result of an accident that produced unusually severe injuries, or was it the result of deliberate violence carried out in a confined space? In the next section, the focus will shift to the formal charges, the construction of the prosecution's case, and the way Michael Peterson's past, including the earlier staircase death in Germany, was brought back into the narrative. After the medical examiner ruled Kathleen Peterson's death a homicide, the investigation moved decisively toward prosecution. Michael Peterson was charged with murder, and the quiet ambiguity that had defined the early hours of the case gave way to a structured legal narrative. From this point forward, every aspect of Michael's life, past and present, would be examined for relevance, motive, and pattern. Central to the prosecution's strategy was the construction of context. Without eyewitnesses or a clear weapon, the state relied on circumstantial evidence to explain why Michael would kill his wife. They did not argue that the act was planned long in advance. Instead, they suggested a confrontation that escalated, one fueled by secrecy, financial pressure, and the risk of exposure. Investigators uncovered Michael's history of sexual relationships with men, including email correspondence and online activity. These interactions were kept hidden from Kathleen. The prosecution argued that if Kathleen had discovered this aspect of Michael's life, It could have led to a volatile confrontation. This theory did not require proof that such a discovery occurred, only that the secret existed and carried potential consequences. Financial records were also introduced. Kathleen's income had become essential to maintaining the household. The state suggested that Michael depended on her financially, and that the loss of her support would have threatened his lifestyle. Again, this was presented as contextual pressure rather than a direct cause. Perhaps the most controversial element of the case emerged when prosecutors revisited Michael's past in Germany. Years earlier, Elizabeth Ratliff, whose children Michael helped raise, had been found dead at the bottom of a staircase. At the time, authorities ruled the death natural, attributing it to a cerebral hemorrhage. No suspicion had been directed at Michael. Now, with Kathleen's death under scrutiny, the state argued that the similarities were too significant to ignore. 2 women, 2 staircases, 2 deaths. Prosecutors sought to introduce evidence from the earlier case, reframing it as potentially violent rather than medical. This decision would become one of the most disputed aspects of the trial. The defense argued that the German death had been thoroughly investigated and ruled natural, and that revisiting it was prejudicial. The prosecution countered that the pattern was relevant and probative. The court allowed the evidence. The introduction of the earlier staircase death dramatically altered public perception. What had once seemed like an isolated tragedy now appeared, at least rhetorically, as part of a disturbing pattern. The jury would hear testimony from experts who re-examined the German autopsy findings, suggesting that Elizabeth Ratliff's injuries might have been misinterpreted. The defense pushed back forcefully. They presented their own medical experts who maintained that Ratliff died from natural causes and that no forensic evidence supported homicide. They argued that coincidence, however unsettling, was not proof. As the case moved toward trial, both sides prepared for a battle defined less by what was known and more by how evidence could be interpreted. The prosecution leaned on narrative cohesion, secrets, pressure, and repetition. The defense focused on scientific uncertainty and reasonable doubt. Michael Peterson maintained his innocence. He did not attempt to flee. He did not confess. He prepared to testify. What made this case particularly complex was its reliance on inference. There were no fingerprints on a weapon, no recorded confession, no eyewitness account of violence. Instead, the jury would be asked to weigh competing explanations for the same physical facts. By the time opening statements approached, the case had already expanded beyond the stairwell in Durham. It now encompassed decades of personal history, private behavior, and unresolved questions from another country. In the next section, the focus will shift inside the courtroom, examining how the trial unfolded, how experts clashed, and how the story of the staircase was presented to a jury tasked with determining guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The trial of Michael Peterson unfolded as a prolonged examination of interpretation. From the outset, it was clear that the courtroom would become a battleground between narratives, rather than a forum for definitive proof. Each side presented the same physical facts and asked the jury to see them through entirely different lenses. The prosecution opened by framing Kathleen Peterson's death as the culmination of hidden conflict. They described a marriage built on omissions, financial reliance, concealed sexual relationships, and the strain of maintaining appearances. The stairwell, they argued, was not the site of an accident, but the final location of an assault that began with confrontation and ended with repeated blows. To support this theory, the state relied heavily on forensic testimony. Bloodstain pattern analysts described the distribution of blood on the stairwell walls as evidence of impact and motion. They spoke of cast-off patterns consistent with an object being swung. The implication was clear. Kathleen had been struck multiple times, while upright or partially upright. Medical experts for the prosecution testified that the number and depth of Kathleen's scalp lacerations exceeded what they would expect from a fall. They acknowledged the lack of skull fractures but argued that the injuries could still be fatal without them. The emphasis was placed on repetition, multiple injuries delivered in succession. The defense countered by dismantling certainty. Their experts testified that staircases can produce multiple points of impact, especially if a person slips, attempts to rise, and falls again. They emphasized that scalp lacerations bleed profusely, and that blood volume alone is not a reliable indicator of violence. They also challenged bloodstain pattern analysis itself. Defense witnesses questioned the scientific foundation of certain conclusions, arguing that interpretation can be subjective and influenced by preconceived theories. They pointed out that no murder weapon had ever been found, and no definitive cast-off object was identified. Michael Peterson took the stand in his own defense. He described the evening calmly, repeating his account of events. He denied any argument, denied any violence, and maintained that Kathleen fell. His testimony was measured, at times emotional, but consistent with his earlier statements. Cross-examination focused on his credibility. Prosecutors questioned him about his undisclosed sexual relationships, suggesting that he had lied to his wife and was capable of deception. Michael did not deny these relationships, but characterized them as separate from his marriage. He maintained that they had no bearing on Kathleen's death. The earlier staircase death in Germany was introduced through testimony and records. The prosecution highlighted similarities. The defense emphasized the original ruling and the absence of criminal suspicion at the time. Jurors were left to decide whether coincidence could reasonably explain two similar tragedies. As the trial progressed, its emotional weight became apparent. Photographs of the stairwell were shown repeatedly. Audio of the emergency call was played. Witnesses described blood, injuries, and loss in clinical terms, even as the human reality hovered beneath the surface. Throughout the proceedings, the absence of certain evidence was as significant as what was presented. There were no witnesses to violence, no confession, no definitive timeline placing Michael at the stairwell at the moment of injury. The case rested on whether the prosecution's explanation was more plausible than the defense's, and whether it rose to the standard of proof required for conviction. After closing arguments, the jury deliberated. They were tasked with weighing expert against expert, interpretation against interpretation, and deciding whether doubt remained reasonable. The verdict, when it came, was decisive. In the next section, the focus will shift to the outcome of the trial, the sentence imposed, and the years that followed. Years marked by appeals, re-examinations, and new questions about the reliability of the evidence that secured a conviction. Part 7 will continue. The Staircase, Part 7 of 8. Conviction, collapse, and re-examination. The jury found Michael Peterson guilty of murder. He was sentenced to life in prison. The verdict brought a sense of finality to the courtroom, but it did not bring closure to the case itself. Instead, it marked the beginning of a long period of legal uncertainty, one in which the foundations of the conviction would be repeatedly questioned. In the years following the trial, Michael Peterson maintained his innocence. From prison, he continued to assert that Kathleen's death was accidental, and that the verdict rested on flawed forensic interpretation rather than proof. His legal team pursued appeals, focusing not on alternative narratives, but on the integrity of the evidence used against him. As appellate attorneys reviewed the trial record, concerns emerged about one of the prosecution's key forensic witnesses. A bloodstain pattern analyst who had testified with confidence about cast-off patterns and impact dynamics was later found to have overstated credentials and misrepresented aspects of his expertise in multiple cases. Subsequent reviews revealed that his work had been challenged elsewhere, raising broader questions about reliability. This discovery did not automatically overturn Michael Peterson's conviction, but it undermined a significant pillar of the prosecution's case. Bloodstain analysis had been central to framing the stairwell as a crime scene rather than an accident site. If that analysis was flawed or overstated, the certainty presented to the jury came into question. Courts began to acknowledge these concerns. Eventually, Michael Peterson was granted a new hearing based on issues related to forensic testimony. This development did not declare him innocent, nor did it erase the original verdict. It acknowledged that the trial may have been influenced by evidence later deemed unreliable. After years in prison, Peterson was released on bond while awaiting further proceedings. By this point, the case had transformed in the public eye. What had once been framed as a straightforward homicide conviction was now widely viewed as a cautionary example of forensic overreach and narrative-driven prosecution. Rather than proceed to a full retrial, Michael Peterson entered an Alford plea. Under this legal mechanism, a defendant maintains innocence while acknowledging that the prosecution's evidence could likely persuade a jury to convict. The plea allowed Peterson to be sentenced to time already served, effectively securing his release without requiring an admission of guilt. The Alford plea did not resolve the central question of the case. It closed the legal chapter without answering the factual one. Kathleen Peterson's manner of death remained officially classified as homicide, but the conviction that once supported that classification no longer stood in its original form. For Kathleen's family, the outcome was deeply unsatisfying. The plea did not deliver affirmation of guilt, nor did it provide clarity. For Michael Peterson, it represented freedom without exoneration, a legal compromise that left his name permanently associated with suspicion. The case continued to be studied, debated, and re-examined by legal scholars, forensic experts, and the public. It became emblematic of the dangers inherent in expert testimony presented with undue certainty, particularly in cases where physical evidence is open to interpretation. Yet even as legal structures shifted, the human reality remained unchanged. Kathleen Peterson was dead. No one disputed that. The unanswered question was how, and whether the justice system had been equipped to determine that truth with confidence. In the final section, the focus will turn to aftermath and legacy. How the case reshaped conversations about forensic science, how those involved move forward, and what remains unresolved when a case ends without clear answers. When the legal proceedings ended, they did so without resolution, in the way most people expect justice to arrive. There was no final verdict affirmed beyond dispute, no definitive finding that settled the question of how Kathleen Peterson died. Instead, the case closed through compromise, procedural rather than factual, and what remained was uncertainty. Kathleen Peterson's death left a permanent absence. She was a professional, a mother, a partner, and a presence within multiple overlapping families. Those who knew her described her as steady and capable, someone who carried responsibility without complaint. Her life, which had been defined largely by competence and commitment, ended in circumstances that became subject to national scrutiny. In that transformation from private individual to public case, much of her identity was reduced to evidence. For Michael Peterson, the years following his release were marked by ambiguity. He was no longer incarcerated, but neither was he cleared. The Alford plea allowed him to leave prison without admitting guilt, but it also ensured that the question of responsibility would follow him indefinitely. Legally free, he remained bound to the case in public memory. The house in Durham, once a place of routine and gathering, became inseparable from the narrative of the staircase. Images of the narrow steps, the walls marked by blood, and the confined space where Kathleen was found continue to define the case visually. The physical environment, so ordinary in its design, became symbolic of how violence and accident can appear nearly indistinguishable when viewed after the fact. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of the case lies in its impact on forensic science. The scrutiny of bloodstain pattern analysis, already underway in other contexts, gained urgency through this trial. Experts began to more openly acknowledge the limits of interpretation and the risks of presenting subjective conclusions as scientific certainty. The case became a reference point in discussions about expert testimony, courtroom persuasion, and the psychology of juror trust. The revisiting of the earlier staircase death in Germany also raised lasting ethical questions. How should prior tragedies be weighed when they resemble one another? At what point did pattern recognition become prejudice? The Peterson case offered no easy answers, only a cautionary example of how past events can be reframed under new suspicion. Importantly, the case never produced a universally accepted alternative explanation. The defense argued for an accidental fall, and some independent experts later proposed theories involving underlying medical conditions or atypical injury mechanisms. None were definitively proven. The absence of certainty does not equate to proof of innocence, nor does it confirm guilt. It marks the boundary of what evidence can support. True crime often promises clarity, an ending where the truth is revealed and justice neatly served. The staircase resists that structure. It remains a case defined by limits. Limits of science, limits of memory, limits of narrative. It forces uncomfortable recognition that some deaths, even those examined exhaustively, cannot be fully explained. What can be stated with confidence is narrow but firm. Kathleen Peterson died in her home. She suffered severe injuries at the bottom of a staircase. The legal system attempted to determine why, and in doing so exposed both its strengths and its vulnerabilities. In the end, the staircase is not just the story of a death or a trial. It is a study in ambiguity, of how ordinary lives can become forensic puzzles, and how the search for certainty can sometimes reveal only how little we truly know. The staircase remains. The questions remain. And the silence left behind by Kathleen Peterson's absence continues to define the space where answers were once expected to stand.